So hello everybody, welcome to my talk. Today I'm going to talk about, as our MC mentioned, AnalogJS, but before that let me briefly introduce myself. I work as a front-end tech lead at a company called BlinkOps, and besides that I'm also a co-maintainer of NGRX, core team member of AnalogJS. I'm the creator of NGRX Signals and NGRX Signal Store. If you're from the Angular ecosystem, you probably heard of this library. I'm also Google Developer Expert in Angular and co-organizer of NG Belgrade conference. If you have Twitter or X, you can find me there by searching for my handle, Marko STDev. I'm also using LinkedIn, so you can search for my first and last name, and you will find me there. So let's see what is AnalogJS. It's a full-stack Angular meta framework. It's powered by Vite and Nitro, and I like to say that it actually pushes Angular to the next level. So this is the list of functionalities in general that Angular as a framework provides. We have some core functionalities. We have routing, forms, APIs for sending HTTP requests, SSR, command line interface. We have packages, for example, for animations, and many other features. And then AnalogJS extends this with hybrid SSR and SSG support, with file-based router, with server-side data fetching. We also have the ability to define API or server routes. This is why we call it full-stack framework. There is also out-of-the-box support for markdown content, ability to write single file components. This is my favorite part of Analog, and we will cover it later in more details. And in addition to these functionalities, there are also two AnalogJS packages. One is to provide Astro integration, so we can use Angular components instead of our Astro files. Another one is Vite support, so to be able to write Vite unit tests in Angular. Let's first talk about file-based routing. So when it comes to file-based routing, we can say this is convention over configuration compared to regular Angular router where we define our routes as configurations where we manually map each path to a specific component. Here we define some file structure, and then based on this file structure, routes are generated. So yeah, routes are defined using folders and files in source app pages folder. Every file that ends with .page.ts will be considered as a route file. There is also out-of-the-box support for content routes, so we can use Markdown directly. And yeah, we have ability to define pathless routes, static dynamic layout, and catch-all routes. Similar functionalities that we have in most of the meta frameworks, let's say, in Nuxt, Next.js, Remix, and others. So let's see this example. If we want to define the index page, we can name it index.page.ts. Another way is to use this pathless convention. So inside of the round brackets, we can just put some kind of label for us, like for better readability, but this name will not end up as a route segment. We can also define pathless directories if we want to have better organization inside of our pages folder. So for example, we can group pages that belong to the same domain together, but we don't want to add additional segments, so we can use, in this example, marketing as a directory name, and then we can define about and contact pages. As I already mentioned, Markdown support is there, so we can use Markdown for static files. Yep, so in addition to pathless routes, we can also define pathless layout routes. Here we have the example for login and sign-up page, and then I defined the page here that has the same name as the directory name here, so this will become a parent or layout route of these two routes. We can define regular static routes, like inside of the products directory. We can use the same convention for a pathless route, so when /products URL is reached, this page will be displayed. We also can define layout route for this page. If we want to define dynamic routes, we can use this convention with the square brackets. And in addition to nesting with directories, if we want to add additional segment to our route without creating a folder, we can use this dot convention. I think this is how it works in Remix as well, if I'm not mistaken. So if I say product ID dot edit page dot ts, the component that is exported from this file will match product / ID / edit route. And the last example is to define a catch-all route. This is a not found page is a good example. All right. So in addition to application or client routes, we also have the ability to define server routes. They are defined inside of the source server routes API folder. Server routes are also file system based, and they are exposed under the API prefix. And we have also the ability to define separate handlers for specific HTTP request methods. So server routes in AnalogJS are powered by Nitro and H3. So if you're familiar with these tools, this is the way how we define server routes in Angular. Let's see the quick example. This is how our file system looks like. So if I define index.ts file, inside of this file I can define an event handler from H3, export it as a default export, so every time when user reaches /API / version 1 in this case, it will trigger this event handler. Another way is to use this .get, .post, .put suffix. So if we specify HTTP method name as a suffix, handler that is exported from these files will be actually triggered when we match the URL, but also when we match the HTTP method. Another topic that I want to talk about today is server-side data fetching. So what we can do, server-side data fetching is actually used in SSR mode. So the idea is to fetch data on the server before loading the page. So data is transferred to the client without redundant API calls during hydration. So we only want to fetch some data on the server side. When we load data in our browser, we don't want to perform another API call to refresh our collection. We can achieve this by defining a load function in a file that has suffix.server.ts. So in this specific example, if we have users/ID page, we can define the file with the same prefix, users ID, but instead of .page, we can add .server. And then in this file, we can export the function with name load. Inside of this function, we will have access to our parameters, query parameters, to the request and response object. There is also the internal fetch that we can use for direct API calls. And then inside of the body of this function, we can perform, for example, we can send some API calls, or we can access our database to get some data and return it as a result. So then in our page.ts file, in our Angular component, what I did here, first I created a type, I named it load. I'm using load result from the AnalogJS router type, and I'm using a load function from the server file. And by the way, I'm using this load function here just to get the type, just for strong typing. This import here will be removed from the client bundle during bundling. Then, if we use something which is called with component input binding in Angular, we can access the loaded data that is loaded from the server. On the server, we can access it through Angular input. So here, the input name by default is name load. I can just directly name it load here if I want, but for better readability, I named it user, and here, then I have to specify alias, which will be load. So I will get data that is loaded on the server as a signal here, and I can use it wherever I want. For example, in the template, in a component class, anywhere where it is needed. Let's now see this in action. So I will open my web store, and here we have users ID server.ts file, where I want to get ID from the route, and I will just return a simple object that also contains a name. Now, if you go to the page, you can notice that we can access this through an input. Angular, as I mentioned, AnalogJS will by default provide input with name load. So if we want to rename it, we have to use this alias, and then we can access the loaded data as a signal. So if I now go to my example, which does not look very nice, but anyway, let's see what we have here. Let me clean up the network tab and do a hard refresh. Let me filter by fetch request, and you can see that there are no fetch requests here. Why? Because this logic has been executed on the server side. However, if I switch to another page, for example, to /users/2, if I click here, you can see that now the HTTP request has been sent. In other words, on initial load, we have our logic executed on the server, and then when it's loaded, when hydration is finished, our application continues to work as a regular single-page application. All right, single file components, my favorite part. And by the way, single file components are actually experimental, and they will be most likely removed in AnalogJS version 2. We use this just as an experiment, but let me show you how it works. So here, this is the way how we can define a component in Angular. First, we are defining component as a class. Inside of the class body, we are defining some logic. Here I defined count as a state slice, and increment method for updating the count value. Then we have to use component decorator that is exported from Angular core package. Then I have to define a selector, then a template. And if you're not from the Angular community, this might look a bit weird to you, like we are defining template inside of the string. And now inside of the template, we can use class members that we defined here. So properties and methods. In a similar way, we can also define styles for this component. And then for better performance, we can say that we want to have on-push change detection strategy for this component. And let's now see how we can define the same component by use analog single file component convention. So the name instead of .ts will be .analog, or we can also use .ag extension. And single file components are quite similar to Vue and Svelte, so we can use a script tag. Inside of the script tag, we can define our logic. This is something that we did here inside of the class body. Then for template, we will use the template tag. We have direct access to methods and signals as well. And for styles, we will use the style tag. So what it does, out of the box, it will automatically create the selector. We don't have to use on-push change detection. It will be applied by default. In general, we reduced some overhead. Let's now see this in action. By the way, there was an AnalogJS plugin for WebStorm, but it was not updated for the recent versions. So if I open counter.analog here, you can see it's displayed as a plain text. So because of that, I will switch to Visual Studio Code, where we have our component properly highlighted, like syntax is properly highlighted. So let me show you something. Let's imagine that we want to add some data slice, for example, some objects. Let me add here like const data is equal foo bar. And then we want to display it in a template inside of the paragraph, like this. And here I want to add not date, but data. And I want to use JSON pipe to display this as a JSON. So what I have to do in Angular, I have to add JSON pipe to the imports array of my component. And how I can do this in Analog. So I have to import JSON pipe. I think it's called JSON pipe from Angular common, like this. Then I can use define metadata macro that AnalogJS provides. And inside of this define metadata, I can actually define my component configuration. So what we have here, we can use providers if we want to provide some service, and in the same way, we can also use imports in order to add JSON pipe to the imports array. So if I save this, go back to my browser, to the home page, we can see that this is now properly displayed. This is our counter component. However, AnalogJS provides some additional functionalities. We can use something which is called import attributes in order to reduce some repetitive code. So instead of using this, what I can do here, I can say with analog imports, like this, I can remove defined metadata, save this, and if I go back to a browser, refresh the page, it works the same. Okay, let's also see how we can use analog. So there is interoperability between regular Angular components and analog components. If I go to app.ts, or no, it's on the index page, you can notice that I imported my counter component from counter.analog file. Here we see some errors, but we can just ignore them. We need a better intelligence for analog anyway. So we add it here to the imports array and then use it as any other Angular component. All right. So if you want to take a look at these slides that we just saw, you can scan this QR code or go to this URL. And with this, thank you very much for your time and attention. Enjoy the lunch.